Valeria was raised in the luxury and power of the Contini crime family, groomed from childhood to become its future leader. Bianca, her identical twin sister, was secretly taken away at birth after their grandmother, terrified of the family's ancient curse of twins, ordered the sisters to be separated forever. While Valeria grew up surrounded by wealth, power, and danger, Bianca lived an ordinary life in Chicago, dedicating herself to helping others as a compassionate emergency room nurse. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The Contini estate rose out of the Long Island fog like something conjured rather than built, its iron gates wreathed in ivy that had been trained over 40 years to grow exactly where the gardeners wanted it and nowhere else. Valeria Contini stood at the window of her third-floor bedroom, the one with the view of the black water and the private dock where her father's boats waited like patient animals, and watched the sun bleed out over the Sound. She had learned, a long time ago, that a Contini did not flinch, not at blood, not at grief, not at the particular sound a man made when he understood he was about to die. She had learned it the way other girls learned piano, by repetition, by her grandmother's hand closing hard around her wrist when she trembled, by the low, patient voice of her father telling her that mercy was a luxury the family could not afford to teach its heir. Tonight there would be 300 guests in the ballroom below her, drinking champagne poured by men who had, in another life, poured blood into the Atlantic. Tonight was her 30th birthday, and her father intended to announce, in front of the 5 families and the men who mattered from Palermo to Providence, that Valeria Contini would inherit everything: the empire, the debts, the enemies. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and thought, not for the first time, of the sister she had never met. Nobody spoke of Bianca in this house. The name did not exist in the family Bible, had been razed out of the hospital records her father's men had long ago purchased and destroyed, existed now only in the small, cracked place inside Valeria, where a phantom ache lived, the ache of a woman who had never held her twin's hand, and yet, in dreams, sometimes felt fingers lace through hers. Her grandmother, Nonna Assunta, had told her the story only once, the night Valeria turned 16, and asked why there was a locked room on the 2nd floor that no one entered. The old woman's face had gone the colour of ash. Due gemelle, una maledizione. 2 twins, 1 curse. It was older than the Contini fortune, older than America itself, a superstition carried across the ocean in the pocket of a great-great-grandmother from a Sicilian village where twin daughters were believed to split a single soul between them, and one of the 2 would always, eventually, destroy the family that raised them both. Nonna Assunta had not questioned it. She had simply acted. The night the twins were born, while Valeria's mother lay unconscious from the blood loss, an infant was carried out through the service entrance in a car that drove north and did not stop until it reached Chicago, and papers were signed, and money changed hands, and a story was invented for the adoptive family. An infant surrendered by a young mother who could not keep her. Valeria had spent years hating her grandmother for it, in the private way one hates the dead, since Nonna Assumpta herself had gone to whatever reckoning waited for women like her 3 winters ago. But hate did not change the shape of the hollow the sister-shaped absence left. Some nights, Valeria caught herself setting 2 coffee cups down before catching her mistake. A knock came at the door. Marco. She knew it was him before he spoke, the way you know weather is coming before the first drop falls, a change in the pressure of a room. 10 minutes, Miss Contini. His voice through the door was low, controlled, entirely professional, and it did something to her chest anyway that she refused to examine too closely. Come in, Marco. He stepped inside in the black tuxedo the house had ordered for him, and for one unguarded second, Valeria let herself look, really look, the way she was never permitted to look at the man assigned to keep her alive. Marco Vitale was not handsome in the soft, magazine way of the men who orbited her at fundraisers. He was handsome the way a blade is handsome, purposeful, cold-edged, built for one thing, and beautiful because of how completely he served that purpose. 3 years he had guarded her. 3 years she had told herself the tightening in her stomach when he entered a room was vigilance, nothing more, the animal awareness of proximity to danger. Your father wants you downstairs before the toast, Marco said, and I need you to stay inside the ballroom tonight. Not the terrace, not the garden. Is there a reason, or is this simply you being you? Something flickered behind his dark eyes, not quite a smile. Marco did not permit himself smiles on duty, but its shadow. There's chatter. Nothing confirmed. Salvatore Moretti's people were seen at the marina 2 nights ago. Valeria's spine straightened, the debutante posture falling away, and the boss's daughter rising underneath it like a second skeleton. The Morettis wouldn't dare. Not at my own birthday. The Morettis, Marco said, have wanted your father's territory since before either of us was born. They'll dare whatever they think they can survive. She studied him, the tightness at his jaw, the way his hand rested, unconsciously, near the concealed holster at his ribs. Marco Vitale did not worry easily. He had killed men with less expression than he wore now. You're frightened, she said quietly, testing the word like a stone dropped into water. I don't get frightened, Miss Contini. I get careful. He held the door. After you. She walked past him close enough to catch the clean cedar scent of him beneath the wool of his jacket, and told herself, as she had told herself for 3 years, that the small catch in her breath was nothing at all. Downstairs the ballroom glittered like something built to make God jealous. Chandeliers the size of small cars, a 200-year-old Steinway trucked in from Vienna, ice sculptures of the Contini crest slowly weeping into silver trays. Her father, Don Raffaele Contini, stood at the centre of it, in a suit that cost more than most men's homes. His silver hair combed back from a face that had once been called beautiful and was now simply called dangerous. The 2 things having long ago become, in this family, synonymous. My daughter, he announced, raising his glass as the room fell into the particular silence reserved for men who could have you killed by lifting a finger. The future of everything I have built. Applause. Kisses on both cheeks from men whose hands, Valeria knew, had done terrible things. Champagne that tasted, as it always did at these events, faintly of obligation. She found Marco's eyes across the room, once, twice, a third time, and each time he was already watching her, and each time he looked away half a second too late to pretend he hadn't been. It was near midnight, during the toast to the future, glass raised high in her father's hand, the whole ballroom turned toward her like sunflowers toward a dying light, that the first shot came through the terrace doors. The chandelier above the dance floor exploded into 1,000 falling stars of glass before Valeria's mind caught up to the sound of the gunfire that had shattered it. There is a particular silence that follows a gunshot in a crowded room. Not true silence, but the held breath quiet of 300 people simultaneously deciding whether to run or freeze. And Valeria stood inside that silence for exactly 1 second before Marco's arm came around her waist like a steel bar and threw her to the marble floor beneath the weight of his own body. "Stay down," he said against her ear, his voice utterly without panic, which frightened her more than panic would have. "Stay down and don't move." Screaming erupted around them. Women in gowns scrambling beneath tables, men reaching for weapons they had smuggled in despite the house rule against it, waiters dropping silver trays that rang against the marble like dissonant bells. Another shot. Then 2 more, close together, and the crystalline chime of a second chandelier taking a stray round. Marco's weapon was already in his hand. Valeria had not even seen him draw it, the motion faster than thought, and he was scanning the terrace doors where the shots had originated, his body a wall between Valeria and the night beyond the broken glass. "2 shooters," he said, low, to the earpiece she hadn't noticed him wearing. "Terrace, north side. Get the Don to the panic room. I have Valeria." "I have Valeria." Something in the way he said her name, stripped of the honorific, stripped of everything but the fact of her, lodged itself in her chest, even as the world came apart around them. Her father's security detail moved him bodily toward the study, 4 men forming a human shell around Don Raffaele's furious, red-faced insistence that he would not run from anyone in his own house. Valeria caught one glimpse of him being half carried through a service door before Marco hauled her up by the arm and pulled her, low and fast, behind an overturned banquet table. "This way," he said, "the service stairs, now." They moved through the chaos like a single organism, Marco's body angled always toward the threat, his free hand never leaving Valeria's wrist, and she found herself, absurdly, in the middle of gunfire and screaming guests, aware primarily of the warmth of his palm against her pulse point, as if her body had decided that of all the things happening in this room, that was the one worth cataloguing. They reached the service stairwell just as a third round of gunfire tore through the ballroom's east wall, and Marco shoved her through the door ahead of himself, slamming it and throwing the bolt. "Up," he said, "to the panic room, on 3, move." She moved. Her heels, absurd things, 4 inches of Italian leather she had chosen for how they'd look in photographs tomorrow, photographs that would never now exist, caught on the 3rd step, and Marco's hand closed around her elbow before she fell, steadying her without breaking stride. "Talk to me," he said, as they climbed. "Tell me you're not hit." "I'm not hit." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Marco, my father, is being handled. You are my responsibility tonight, only you." They reached the 3rd floor and the reinforced door of the panic room her grandfather had installed decades ago, back when the wars between families were fought with more shells and fewer subtleties. Marco keyed the code with fingers that did not shake, though Valeria noted, with the strange clarity that comes in crisis, that his knuckles were white. Inside, the room was small, windowless, lined with steel, stocked with enough water and canned food to survive a siege. Marco locked the door behind them and immediately checked the room's small bank of monitors, feeds from the cameras scattered across the estate's grounds. "Talk to me," Valeria said, echoing his own words back at him, needing to hear something, anything, to anchor herself. "What's happening down there?" "Your father's detail has the shooters pinned near the boathouse. Local PD's been paid to take 20 minutes getting here, which means we have 20 minutes before this becomes an official matter instead of a family one." He did not look away from the monitors. This wasn't Moretti's usual style. Too loud, too public. Moretti wants your father's territory, not a war that draws federal attention. "Then who—" Marco's jaw tightened. On the monitor, one of the two shooters was dragged, subdued, into the light near the boathouse, and even through the grainy black-and-white feed, Valeria recognized the face. Tommaso Ricci, her father's own consigliere's nephew. A man who had been at her christening. "Someone inside," Marco said quietly. And for the first time that night, something like real fear moved across his face. "Valeria, someone inside your own house wants you dead." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward through everything she had believed true about her life. Not the Morettis, not some rival family with old grievances and new ambitions. Someone who had eaten at her table, who had kissed her cheek at Christmas, who had watched her grow from a child into the heir apparent. Someone from inside the only world she had ever known had decided she needed to die. She sat down hard on the steel bench bolted to the panic room's wall, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Valeria Contini's hands began, visibly, to shake. Marco crossed the small room and knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his, a violation of every protocol he had ever followed, every professional distance he had maintained for 3 years, and held them still. "I need you to listen to me," he said, his dark eyes locked on hers, with an intensity that had nothing to do with duty, and everything to do with something neither of them had ever named aloud. "Whoever did this tonight, they're not finished. Your father's house isn't safe for you anymore. Not tomorrow, not next week. We need to get you somewhere no one would think to look." "There is nowhere," Valeria said, and heard, for the first time in her adult life, real despair in her own voice. "Everyone who matters knows this family. Every safe house, every associate, every cousin twice removed. Someone inside already knew enough to plan this. Marco, there's nowhere left." Marco was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing an absent, unconscious circle against the back of her hand. And when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something almost gentle, almost afraid to say the thing it was about to say. "There's one place," he said, "one person no one in this family has ever thought to look for, because no one in this family is supposed to know she exists." Valeria's breath caught. She did not need him to say the name. She had known somehow, since the moment the first bullet shattered the chandelier, that this night would end with her finally reaching for the one connection she had never been permitted to have. "Bianca," she whispered. Chicago, in early autumn, had a particular grey beauty to it, Bianca Ferro thought, watching the wind push dead leaves across the ambulance bay outside Mercy General's emergency entrance. A city that did not pretend to be anything softer than it was, and loved you anyway if you gave it half a chance. She had worked a 16-hour shift, the kind that left her feeling scraped hollow and strangely alive at once, having pulled a 7-year-old boy back from the edge of a severe asthma attack and held the hand of a 91-year-old woman as she passed quietly, peacefully, surrounded by family who thanked Bianca through their tears for making the end gentle. This was the rhythm of her life, catastrophe and grace arriving hand in hand, and Bianca standing in the middle of it with steady hands and a heart that had never learned to build the calluses the other nurses talked about. "You look like hell, Ferro," said Danny, one of the paramedics, as he wheeled an empty gurney past her toward the ambulance bay doors. "Thank you. I try." She managed a tired smile. "Tell me something good happened today." "The Mrs. Alvarez's kid is stable. Discharged tomorrow, probably." "That's something good," Bianca exhaled, feeling the day settle into her bones. "I'll take it." She had grown up an only child in a modest 3-bedroom in Pilsen, raised by Rosa and Antonio Ferro, a schoolteacher and a union electrician who had wanted children desperately and been told, after years of trying, that biology would never grant them one. Until an adoption agency called out of nowhere with an infant girl who needed a home immediately. No questions to be asked about the birth family, a closed adoption with an unusually generous payment attached that Rosa and Antonio, in their joy and their poverty, had not questioned nearly hard enough. Bianca had known she was adopted since she was old enough to understand the word. What she had never known, what no one in her life had ever told her, because no one in her life knew, was that somewhere on the East Coast, in a house built on money soaked through with violence, a woman with her exact face had grown up believing herself entirely alone in the world, in the particular way only children are alone, surrounded by people and utterly companionless. She checked her phone as she walked toward the staff parking lot, the message notification lighting the screen. Marco. "Not tonight, mio amore. Something came up at work. I'll call you tomorrow. I love you." Bianca smiled, despite the ache of disappointment, typing back a quick, "Stay safe, I love you too," before pocketing the phone. Marco Vitale had entered her life 8 months ago in the least romantic circumstance imaginable. She had treated him for a gunshot wound to the shoulder in the Mercy General trauma bay. No questions asked, per hospital policy, about the vague story he'd offered about a hunting accident that clearly hadn't involved any hunting whatsoever. And something about the quiet, watchful way he held himself, even flat on a gurney, bleeding through a makeshift bandage, had caught at her. He was not a talker. He carried himself like a man who had built high walls around something he did not want examined too closely. And Bianca, who spent her professional life coaxing frightened people into trusting her with their most vulnerable moments, had found herself unable to resist the challenge of him. 8 months later, she still did not entirely know what he did for a living. Some kind of private security work, he'd told her, executive protection, which explained the gun she'd once glimpsed beneath his jacket and the scars that mapped a violent history across his body that he never fully explained. She loved him anyway. Loved the rare moments his guard dropped and something almost boyish moved across his face. Loved the way he listened, really listened, when she talked about her patients, as though her compassion was a species of courage he found himself in awe of. She did not know, walking to her car in the gathering Chicago dusk, that 400 miles away, that same man was driving through the night with her twin sister bleeding adrenaline in the passenger seat, making a decision that would detonate every certainty in Bianca Ferro's carefully ordinary life. Her apartment, when she reached it, was small and warm and hers. Mismatched furniture collected from thrift stores and family hand-me-downs, a wall of photographs charting her whole, unremarkable, beloved life. Rosa and Antonio at her nursing school graduation, both of them crying. A college roommate's wedding. A half-dozen shots of her and Marco, his rare smile visible in maybe 2 of them, which she treasured more than any of the others for their rarity. She microwaved leftover pasta and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, scrolling through nothing in particular on her phone, and thought, as she sometimes did on quiet nights like this one, about the hollow place inside her that she had never been able to name. Rosa and Antonio had given her everything a childhood could hold. She had never wanted for love. And yet there had always been a particular ache, formless and persistent, the sense of an absence shaped like a person she had never met, a phantom limb for a relationship that had never existed. She did not know its name was Valeria. She went to bed early, exhausted, and slept dreamlessly, unaware that somewhere on Interstate 90, a black SUV was closing the distance between 2 lives that had been kept apart, deliberately, violently, for 30 years, and that dawn would bring a knock on her door that would end the only life she had ever known. The knock came at 6:40 in the morning, 3 sharp raps that pulled Bianca up out of sleep with her heart already hammering, the particular alarm of a body that has spent a career learning to wake instantly and completely. She padded to the door in an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, checked the peephole, and felt the floor tilt beneath her. Marco stood in the hallway. Beside him stood a woman wearing a torn, blood-stained cocktail dress, mascara streaked down cheeks, hollow with exhaustion and fear. A woman with Bianca's own face staring back at her like a reflection that had somehow stepped free of the glass and grown a separate, terrified soul. Bianca opened the door because her hands moved before her mind caught up to the impossibility in front of her. And for a long, suspended moment, the 2 women simply stood there, staring at each other across the threshold, twin faces slack with matching shock. "I don't understand," Bianca finally said, her voice small. "May we come in?" the woman asked, and her voice, Bianca's own voice, pitched slightly differently, carrying an accent trained into something crisper, more East Coast, cracked on the last word. "Please, I don't have anywhere else." Bianca stepped back, some deep instinct, the same instinct that let her calm a screaming trauma patient, overriding her shock, and let them both inside. They sat at her small kitchen table, the 3 of them, while grey morning light crept across the linoleum, and Marco, his own face drawn tight with an exhaustion Bianca had never seen on him, explained. The Contini name, the empire built on blood and silence, the curse of twins that had torn 2 infants apart in a hospital room 30 years ago, the assassination attempt at last night's birthday gala, the traitor inside the walls of Valeria's own family. Bianca listened without speaking, her nurse's training keeping her face steady even as her entire understanding of her own existence rearranged itself around her, piece by piece, like a house being quietly demolished and rebuilt in real time. "You're my sister," she finally said, when Marco fell silent. Not a question, a fact settling into the shape of her body, filling a hollow she had never had a name for. "Twin," Valeria said. "I found out about you 3 years ago. My grandmother told me the story before she died, and I hired someone, quietly, carefully, to find you. I never intended to make contact. I told myself it was safer for you not to know I existed, safer for both of us." Her hands trembled around the coffee mug Bianca had set in front of her, untouched. "I was wrong to think I'd never need you." "Need me how?" Valeria's eyes, Bianca's own eyes, dark brown flecked with amber, staring back at her from a stranger's ruined makeup, met hers with a desperate, unguarded honesty. "I need you to let me be you, for a little while, until we find out who's trying to kill me." The kitchen went very quiet. "You want to steal my life," Bianca said slowly. "I want to borrow it. I would never," Valeria stopped, visibly gathering herself. "No one outside my father's inner circle knows you exist, Bianca. Not the Morettis, not the traitor in our house, not anyone who might come looking for me. If I disappear into your life for a few weeks, I become invisible, a ghost. The one place on earth no assassin would think to search is inside the ordinary life of a Chicago ER nurse. And what happens to my life while you're wearing it? You'd need to disappear too, somewhere safe. My father has properties. Marco can arrange." "Marco?" Bianca said, and turned to him for the first time since they'd sat down, something cold moving through her chest as the full shape of the situation assembled itself. "You're her bodyguard?" "Yes." "And you're the man I've been in love with for 8 months." The silence that followed was its own kind of confession. Marco's jaw worked, and for the first time in the 8 months Bianca had known him, she watched him struggle to find words. This man who moved through crisis with the fluid, unbothered confidence of a blade cutting water. "I didn't know," he said finally. "Bianca, I swear to you, I didn't know Valeria had a sister until 6 hours ago." "If I had known..." "You would have what? Not fallen for me because I happened to look like your client?" The words came out sharper than Bianca intended, grief and betrayal tangling together before she'd had time to sort out which was which. "I fell for you," Marco said, low and fierce, closing the distance between them despite Valeria's presence, despite everything. "Whatever happens now, whatever this woman needs from us, I want you to hear that clearly. I love you, not her. You." Bianca looked past him, at her twin sister, sitting rigid and desperate at her kitchen table, wearing the wreckage of a life Bianca had never been permitted to know existed, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the first fragile stirrings of the compassion that had built her entire adult life. The compassion that could not look at suffering, even suffering this strange and unwelcome, and turn away from it. "If I do this," Bianca said slowly, "if I let you become me, I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let him fall in love with you while you're wearing my face." Bianca's voice cracked just slightly on the last words. Because I don't think I could survive that. Valeria's eyes filled, and for the first time since she had walked through the door, something genuinely human moved across her composed, aristocratic features. Guilt and fear. And beneath both of those, a loneliness so old and so deep that Bianca, despite everything, felt her heart twist with unwanted recognition. They were sisters. Whatever else stood between them, that was true, and it lived in both their bodies like a shared pulse. "I promise," Valeria whispered. It was, Bianca would think much later, the first lie her sister ever told her, though neither of them understood that yet, sitting in the grey Chicago morning, already beginning to trade the shapes of their two separate lives. They gave it 3 days. 3 days locked inside Bianca's apartment with the blinds drawn, while Marco worked his contacts to arrange a safe house for Bianca upstate, and Valeria learned, hour by hour, how to disappear into the shape of a woman she had known for less than a week. "Tell me about your patients," Valeria said on the first afternoon, notebook open on the kitchen table, because she had realized almost immediately that becoming Bianca meant more than borrowing a face. It meant learning an entire interior life, an accumulated decade of small facts that would betray her the instant someone who actually knew Bianca Ferro asked the wrong casual question. "Which ones?" "All of them. The ones you talk about, the ones who matter to you." Valeria's pen hovered over the page. "I need to know what would make you cry, and what would make you laugh, and what you'd say if someone asked you about the worst night you ever had at that hospital." Bianca considered her twin, this stranger with her own face, sitting at the small kitchen table that had witnessed a decade of Bianca's ordinary, unremarkable joys, and felt something loosen in her chest, some tightly wound thing she had not realized she was holding. "The worst night," she said slowly, "was a car accident. 5 kids, 1 car coming home from prom. 2 didn't make it. I held the hand of a 17-year-old boy while he died, and afterward I sat in the supply closet and cried for 40 minutes before I could go back out on the floor." Her voice thickened. "I still think about him. His name was Diego. He wanted to be an architect." Valeria wrote nothing down. She simply sat, absorbing it, her composed face cracking open for a moment into something raw. "How do you survive that?" she asked. "Over and over. How do you keep choosing to walk back into a room where that kind of thing happens?" "Because someone has to," Bianca said simply. "And because for every Diego, there are 10 people I get to save. You hold on to those. You have to, or the job eats you alive." They spent the second day on smaller things, the names of Bianca's co-workers, the particular way she took her coffee, black, 1 sugar, never cream, an allergy Bianca had developed in her 20s, the modest studio apartment's quirks, the sticking third stair, the neighbour across the hall who fed a stray cat that technically wasn't allowed in the building. Valeria absorbed all of it, with the same ferocious, disciplined focus she had once applied to memorizing the family's shipping routes and their coded ledgers. A woman who had spent her whole life learning things by rote, because the alternative, improvisation, in a world where mistakes meant bodies, had never been available to her. "You're very good at this," Bianca observed on the second evening, watching Valeria practice signing Bianca's name, a looping, distinctive cursive Bianca had developed in nursing school, over and over on a legal pad until the forgery was nearly indistinguishable from the original. I had to be good at things growing up. Valeria did not look up from the page. My father did not believe in a childhood that included failure. I learned to shoot a gun before I learned to ride a bicycle. I learned 4 languages because a Contini heir cannot be caught not understanding a threat made in her own home. I learned very early that softness was a luxury afforded to other people's daughters. She finally set the pen down. You had a childhood, Bianca, a real one. I can see it in you, in the way you touch things gently, in the way you assume by default that people mean well. I never had the luxury of that assumption. Something in her twin's voice, not bitterness exactly, but a grief so old it had calcified into simple fact, made Bianca reach across the table and, for the first time, take Valeria's hand. I'm sorry, she said, for what our grandmother did to both of us. Valeria's fingers tightened around hers, and for a moment neither woman spoke, the silence carrying the particular weight of 30 years of separate loneliness, finally, briefly, touching. I need to ask you something, Valeria said eventually, and I need you to answer honestly, because it matters more than anything else in this apartment. Marco. Tell me what he's like. Not the bodyguard. The man you love. Bianca considered the question and found, to her own surprise, that answering it hurt. A small, sharp ache, like pressing a bruise to check if it still bloomed colour. He doesn't talk much, not at first. You have to earn it out of him, patience mostly, just being there without demanding anything back. But when he does open up, she stopped, throat tightening. He's funny, in this dry, unexpected way. He remembers everything I tell him, even the small stuff, the stuff I mention once in passing. He looks at me like... She shook her head. He looks at me like I'm something he still can't quite believe he's allowed to have. Valeria's face, when Bianca glanced up, had gone very still, and something in her twin's eyes, something that looked uncomfortably like hunger, made a cold thread of unease move through Bianca's chest. You have to be careful with him, Bianca said, more sharply than she intended. He's not a role to play, Valeria. He's a person I love. I know. Valeria's voice was quiet. I promise you, I know. But even as she said it, Bianca noticed that her sister's eyes had drifted, unconsciously, to the framed photograph on the counter. Marco's rare, unguarded smile, caught by Bianca's camera on a Sunday morning 8 months ago, and lingered there a moment too long to be entirely comfortable. By the 3rd day, when Marco arrived to drive Bianca to the safe house 2 hours north, the two sisters had built, in 72 frantic hours, something that would need to survive weeks of impersonation. A shared language of gestures and facts and inside jokes manufactured on the spot. A scaffolding of borrowed identity that both women understood, without saying it aloud, was far more fragile than either of them wanted to believe. Be careful, Bianca said at the door, hugging her twin sister for the first and possibly last time. You too, Valeria said against her ear, and for just a moment, holding her, Bianca felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of embracing herself. A mirror that breathed, that had its own separate heartbeat, that carried, she was beginning to understand, its own separate and dangerous hungers.
The safe house Marco had arranged for Bianca sat 2 hours north of Chicago, a modest cabin on a private lake owned by a retired nurse Bianca had once worked alongside, a woman discreet enough and grateful enough for a decade-old favour to ask no questions about why Bianca needed somewhere quiet and off the books for a few weeks. Bianca hated it within the first hour. Not the cabin itself. The cabin was lovely, all exposed beam and lake-facing windows, but the stillness of it, the absence of purpose, the particular unbearable idleness of a woman built for motion, suddenly given nothing to do but wait. She called the hospital and used up 2 weeks of accumulated vacation time, inventing a family emergency vague enough to satisfy her supervisor's questions. And then she sat by the lake with her phone in her lap, waiting for updates from Marco that arrived in terse, careful texts designed to reveal nothing to anyone who might somehow be reading over his shoulder. She's settling in, learning fast. No contact from the traitor. Still investigating. Miss you. That last one had come 3 days in, and Bianca had stared at it for a long time before typing back, miss you too. Feeling the ache of an absence that was, she was slowly realizing, compounding. Not just Marco's absence, but the strange sudden loss of the sister she had known for exactly 3 days and already, impossibly, missed. 200 miles south in Chicago, Valeria Contini was learning to become Bianca Ferro, one careful, terrified shift at a time. Her first day on the hospital floor, Marco having used considerable resources to smooth over the administrative gap, a forged doctor's note explaining Bianca's brief absence as a migraine flare-up requiring rest, Valeria stood in the Mercy General locker room in her sister's scrubs, staring at her own reflection in a mirror bolted to a rust-spotted locker, and felt, for the first time in her adult life, something close to genuine terror. She had faced men with guns. She had sat across tables from killers who wanted her father's territory and would have slit her throat without a second thought if the politics had shifted half a degree. None of it had frightened her, the way the prospect of a 12-year-old boy with a broken arm looking up at her with total trust, expecting the competent, gentle care of a woman who had spent a decade learning to heal instead of destroy, frightened her now. "You've got this," Danny said, passing her in the hallway with his usual easy grin, clapping her on the shoulder in a gesture of casual familiarity that made Valeria's whole body go rigid with the effort of not flinching. "Migraine gone? You look a little pale." "Better," she managed. "Thank you, Danny." She had memorized his name from Bianca's careful briefing. She had memorized 40 other names besides: nurses, doctors, the woman at reception with the photograph of 3 grandchildren on her desk, the security guard who liked to talk about his fantasy football league. She moved through the first shift like a woman crossing a minefield blindfolded, relying entirely on the map her sister had drawn for her in 72 frantic hours, terrified that any wrong step would detonate the entire fragile architecture of the deception. By the second week, something began unexpectedly to shift. A woman came into the ER with chest pains that turned out, after testing, to be a panic attack rather than the cardiac event she'd feared. And Valeria, trained her whole life to read fear in a room the way other people read weather, sat with her, held her hand, talked her down from the edge of terror with a gentleness she had not known she possessed. The woman cried and thanked her, called her an angel, and Valeria walked out of the room afterward and stood in the supply closet exactly as Bianca had once done for a dying boy named Diego, and found herself crying too, not from grief, but from the strange, overwhelming discovery that she was capable of this, that somewhere beneath 30 years of training in violence and control, there had always been a woman who could hold a stranger's trembling hand and mean it. She began, without entirely meaning to love the work. It terrified her more than any assassination attempt ever had. The possibility that she might be, underneath everything her father had built her to become, someone entirely different, someone who wanted this life. The small apartment, the ordinary rhythms, the daily accumulation of small kindnesses that added up, shift after shift, to something that felt, disturbingly, like meaning. And then there was Marco. He came to the apartment most evenings, as he always had with Bianca, bringing takeout, settling onto the worn couch to decompress after his own long days spent managing the fallout of the assassination attempt, quietly circling the traitor's identity, running down leads, keeping both twins alive through sheer force of will and paranoid competence. Valeria found herself, each evening, having to remind herself with increasing effort that this man's warmth, his rare smiles, the way he reached automatically for her hand while they watched television, belonged to her sister, not to her. "You've been different lately," Marco said one evening, 3 weeks in, studying her with the particular focused attention that had once, back at the Contini estate, made Valeria's skin prickle with something she'd refused to name. More quiet, more careful somehow. "Long shifts," Valeria said, deploying the excuse Bianca had armed her with for exactly this contingency. "Maybe." Marco did not look convinced, "but it's more than that. Sometimes you look at me like you're seeing me for the first time, like you're trying to memorize something." Valeria's pulse quickened, danger and desire tangling together in a way she had spent 3 years as Marco's actual employer, carefully training herself never to feel. "Maybe I am," she said quietly, and immediately hated herself for the honesty of it, watching Marco's dark eyes narrow with something between confusion and a dangerous, unwilling curiosity. "Bianca," he said slowly, testing the borrowed name against her like a key that no longer quite fit the lock. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Valeria lied, and looked away first, before he could see whatever was written across her face, before he could see the thing neither of them was ready yet to name. By the 4th week, Marco Vitale had built his entire professional life on the discipline of noticing what other people missed. It was the skill that had kept Don Raffaele Contini's daughter alive through 3 assassination attempts before this one, the skill that had turned a poor kid from Bensonhurst into the most trusted enforcer in one of the country's most dangerous families. He noticed everything. It was, he was beginning to understand with a growing unease he could not entirely name, becoming a problem. The woman living in Bianca Ferro's apartment, wearing Bianca Ferro's scrubs, answering to Bianca Ferro's name, was not Bianca Ferro. He knew this, intellectually, with total certainty. He had, after all, orchestrated the entire deception himself. And yet some deeper animal part of his brain, the part trained over a decade of protecting Valeria Contini to read her specific tells, her specific silences, was beginning to notice things that unsettled him at a level below conscious thought. The real Bianca held a coffee mug with both hands cupped close to her chest, the gesture of a woman who had spent a childhood being told to keep her hands warm. This woman held it by the handle, one-fingered, elegant, distant. The gesture of a woman who had grown up with servants to worry about warmth for her. The real Bianca laughed with her whole body, a full, unguarded sound that shook her shoulders. This woman's laugh was smaller, more careful, as though she were perpetually testing whether laughter was permitted in the room she currently occupied. And there was the night, 3.5 weeks in, when Marco arrived home late from tracking a lead on the Contini traitor, a name half confirmed through a source inside the Ricci family, and found her standing in the kitchen with a knife in her hand. Not chopping vegetables, but simply holding it, turning it in the light with a familiarity that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with a body that had, at some point, been trained to use a blade as a weapon. "Bianca?" She startled. Actually startled, the knife clattering onto the counter, and for one unguarded second, her face showed something Marco had genuinely never seen on Bianca Ferro's features in 8 months of loving her. Cold, immediate calculation, the swift mental arithmetic of a person assessing whether the man in front of her was a threat. Then it was gone, replaced by something softer, something that looked, to anyone not trained to notice the seams, exactly like Bianca's warmth. "You scared me," she said. "Long day. I didn't hear you come in." "You don't usually hold a knife like that," Marco said carefully, watching her. "Like what?" "Like you're about to use it on someone." The silence that followed stretched half a second too long. "Trauma nurse humour," she said finally, with a small, careful laugh. "You pick things up. Knife wounds, mostly. You start thinking about angles." It was plausible. It was almost certainly the kind of explanation the real Bianca might have offered, if pressed. And yet something in Marco's chest, some old battle-honed instinct that had kept him alive through more violence than most soldiers saw in a career, refused to fully accept it. He found himself, over the following days, testing her, without entirely admitting to himself that he was doing it. He mentioned a patient's name Bianca had told him about months ago, a young mother she'd treated for a difficult delivery, and watched her face for a flicker of recognition that did not quite arrive fast enough. He asked about her parents, Rosa and Antonio, using details Bianca had shared with him early in their relationship, watching her navigate the answers with the careful precision of someone reciting memorized facts rather than living memory. And there was the matter of how she looked at him. Bianca had always looked at him with an open, uncomplicated adoration that had, frankly, terrified him when he'd first recognized it for what it was. The particular vulnerability of a woman who had decided, without reservation, to trust him completely. This woman looked at him differently. There was heat in it, undeniable heat, the kind that made his pulse quicken against every instinct toward professional restraint he had spent a decade cultivating. But there was also something guarded beneath the heat, something watchful, as though she were perpetually calculating the risk of the very desire she couldn't quite hide. It was the watchfulness that undid him, because Marco recognized it. He had seen that exact expression,
that exact, careful, guarded hunger on another woman's face for 3 years, a woman he had guarded with his life and never once permitted himself to touch, because she was his employer's daughter and the future of an empire he served, and wanting her had always felt like reaching for a live wire. The realization arrived at 2 in the morning, 4 weeks and 2 days into the deception, while Marco lay awake beside a woman who breathed differently than the one he had fallen in love with, and it arrived with the force of a physical blow. This is not Bianca. This is Valeria. He lay very still in the darkness, his heart hammering, running back through 4 weeks of small, accumulated wrongness. The coffee mug, the laugh, the knife, the calculating stillness beneath the borrowed warmth, and understood with a horror that curdled immediately into something far more dangerous, that he had spent a month falling deeper in love with Valeria Contini, while believing himself faithful to her sister. He did not wake her. He lay in the dark beside a woman wearing his lover's face and his employer's soul, and tried to understand what, exactly, he was supposed to do with the wreckage of a truth he had not asked for and could no longer unknow. Marco waited 3 days before he said anything, 3 days of watching her with new eyes, cataloguing every small tell he had missed and now could not stop seeing. And on the 3rd night, after she'd come home from a shift and shed her jacket by the door with an exhausted, graceful economy of motion that Bianca had never once displayed in 8 months, he finally spoke the truth aloud. "I know who you are," he said. She went very still, her back to him, jacket still half off one shoulder. "I'm Bianca." "Don't." The word came out harder than he intended, edged with 3 days of accumulated grief and fury, and a desire he despised himself for still feeling. "I've protected you for 3 years, Valeria. I know the sound of your footsteps. I know how you hold a knife. I know how you calculate a room before you decide it's safe. Bianca doesn't do any of that. She never has, because no one ever taught her to survive the way they taught you." Valeria turned slowly, and Marco watched 30 years of trained composure crumble across her face in real time. Watched the mask she had worn her entire life finally, fully, fall away in front of the one person who had learned to read past it. "How long have you known?" she asked, and her voice, stripped of Bianca's careful cadences, had gone back to itself, lower, sharper, carrying the particular authority of a woman raised to command rooms. 4 days. "And you said nothing." I needed to understand what I was going to do about it. Marco crossed the small living room, closing the distance between them with the same controlled, purposeful stride he used when clearing a room of threats. "I have spent 3 years protecting you from a respectful distance, Valeria, because you were my employer's daughter, and I understood, without ever needing to be told, exactly what would happen to both of us if I let myself want something I had no right to want. And then I fell in love with a woman who wore your face, and told myself it was safe because she wasn't you. And now I find out I've been in love with you all along, wearing your sister's life like a disguise, and I don't know whether that makes what I feel a betrayal of Bianca, or the most honest thing I've felt in 3 years. The confession landed between them like a struck match, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the air in the small apartment gone thick and combustible. You should hate me, Valeria said quietly. I lied to you every day for a month. I let you believe you were falling for a woman who doesn't exist. She exists, Marco said. She's simply not the only woman in this apartment. You've been Bianca's careful, borrowed warmth by day, and at night, when you think I'm asleep, you're entirely yourself. Colder, sharper, more frightened than you'll ever let yourself admit. I've watched you fight not to be that woman for a month, Valeria, and I need you to understand something. His voice dropped, rough with an honesty that cost him visibly to give. I don't want you to keep hiding her. I fell in love with the version of you I thought was safe to love. But I think I've been falling in love with the real one the entire time, since long before any of this began. Valeria's eyes filled, 30 years of trained control finally catastrophically failing her in front of the one man who had ever bothered to look past the armor. You can't say that to me, she whispered. I destroyed my sister's happiness to save my own life. You belong to her, Marco. Whatever you feel right now, it's not fair to any of us. Fair has nothing to do with what I feel. He reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and when she didn't, cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that undid something in her chest more thoroughly than any violence ever had. I have spent 3 years being the most disciplined man in your father's employ. I have never once allowed myself to want anything I couldn't have. And I am telling you, Valeria Contini, that I want you. Not the disguise. You. She should have pulled away. Every instinct trained into her by 30 years of Contini discipline screamed at her to maintain the distance, to protect the fragile architecture of the deception that was keeping her alive, to think of her sister's face and the promise she'd made in a Chicago kitchen 4 weeks ago. Instead, she found herself leaning into his palm, her eyes closing, 30 years of careful armor dissolving beneath the simple, devastating fact of being seen, fully, truthfully seen, for the first time in her life. This is a mistake, she whispered, even as her hands found the front of his shirt, even as the distance between them collapsed entirely. Probably, Marco agreed, and kissed her anyway. And the kiss tasted like every unspoken thing that had passed between them across 3 years of professional distance and 4 weeks of borrowed identity, like relief and guilt and hunger, all tangled into a single, unbearable truth. That some collisions, once set in motion, cannot be stopped by wanting to stop them. They broke apart, both breathing hard, and Valeria pressed her forehead to his chest, her whole body trembling with the weight of what they had just done, to themselves, and to the woman 2 hours north of them, who still believed, in a quiet cabin by a lake, that her sister and the man she loved were keeping their promise to leave each other alone. What do we tell her? Valeria asked. Marco's arms tightened around her, and in his silence, Valeria heard the answer neither of them wanted to say aloud, that some promises, once broken, could never be fully repaired, only survived if they were lucky, and mourned if they were not. While Valeria and Marco navigated the wreckage of their confession, the investigation into the assassination attempt had not stopped. Marco had spent his evenings, the ones he wasn't spending falling in love with the wrong sister, or the right one, depending on how you counted it, running down the thread that connected Tommaso Ricci, the consigliere's nephew captured at the boathouse, to whoever had ordered Valeria's death. Tommaso himself had died in Contini custody within 48 hours of his capture, an official story of a heart attack that convinced absolutely no one who understood how the family handled disappointing employees. But before his death, under the particular persuasive methods the Contini organization employed for matters of existential importance, he had given up one name, whispered through broken teeth: Salvatore Moretti. It fit the surface story too well, Marco thought, and that was precisely what troubled him. The Morettis had wanted Contini territory for 2 generations. A public assassination at Valeria's own birthday gala, timed to install chaos right as she was set to inherit. It read exactly like Moretti ambition. Almost too exactly. He drove out to see Don Raffaele directly, 4 weeks into the deception, using the cover story that he needed authorization for additional security resources. A story that was technically true, even if it obscured the deeper reason for the visit. Don Raffaele Contini had aged a decade in a month. The assassination attempt on his only daughter had stripped something vital from the old man, some core certainty about the world he had spent 40 years building, and he received Marco in his study with the hollow-eyed exhaustion of a man who had stopped sleeping. "Tell me you have something," Don Raffaele said without preamble. "Tommaso Ricci named Salvatore Moretti before he died." "I know. I've already put out feelers about a war." The old man's hand shook slightly around his glass of scotch. "But you don't believe it. I can see it on your face, Marco. You've never been able to hide your doubts from me, not since you were 18 years old." Marco chose his words with the same care he applied to clearing a room. Tommaso Ricci was a soldier, a capable one, but not a strategist. Someone recruited him, financed the operation, provided the specific intelligence about the terrace access and the timing of the toast. That kind of operational precision doesn't usually come from outside. It comes from someone who's been inside your house long enough to know its rhythms. Don Raffaele's face went very still. "You're suggesting the order came from inside my own family?" "I'm suggesting Salvatore Moretti may be exactly who he appears to be. An opportunist willing to fund an attack, but not necessarily the architect of it. Someone else built this. Someone with access to your household's patterns. Someone who benefits specifically from Valeria never inheriting." The old man was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something Marco had genuinely never heard from him in a decade of service. Not command, but fear. "There is one man," Don Raffaele said slowly, "who has spent 30 years believing he should have inherited what I built. My own brother, Marco. Enzo." Marco felt something cold settle into his chest. Enzo Contini, Don Raffaele's younger brother, exiled to a comfortable but powerless retirement in Miami 2 decades ago, after a falling out so severe neither man had spoken of its true cause since, had always been, to Marco's knowledge, a peripheral figure, more punchlines than threat, a bitter old man nursing decades-old grievances from the safety of a beachfront condo purchased with a settlement designed to buy his permanent silence. "You think Enzo has the resources for something like this?"
I think Enzo has spent 20 years believing he was cheated out of an empire that should have been his. I think Enzo has had 2 decades to build quiet alliances with families like the Morettis, patient, unhurried alliances designed to look like nothing at all until the moment they mattered.
Don Raffaele's hand tightened around his glass until his knuckles whitened. And I think Enzo has known, somehow, I don't know how, that there is a second Contini daughter he could use as leverage if he ever needed her. The words hit Marco like a physical blow.
You think he knows about Bianca?
I think, Don Raffaele said grimly, that if my brother orchestrated this, he did not do it simply to remove Valeria from the line of succession. He did it because he intends to control who does inherit, and a hidden granddaughter, raised entirely outside this world, malleable and ignorant of the family's true nature, would make a far more useful puppet than a daughter who spent 30 years learning to say no to him. Marco's blood ran cold. 2 hours north, in a quiet cabin by a lake, Bianca Ferro was living under the assumption that she was simply waiting out a temporary danger, unaware that she might, in fact, be the primary target of a conspiracy that had never truly been about Valeria at all. "I need to move her," Marco said, already reaching for his phone. "Now." "Move who?" "Bianca." He was already standing, already calculating the fastest route north, already running through the mental checklist of threats and countermeasures that had kept Valeria alive for 3 years and now needed, urgently, to extend its protection to a woman who had never asked for any of this. If Enzo knows she exists, the cabin isn't safe. Nowhere connected to any of us is safe. Don Raffaele caught his arm as he turned to leave, the old man's grip surprisingly strong for someone who had aged a decade and a month. "Marco." His voice had dropped to something almost pleading, an emotion Marco had never once heard from Don Raffaele Contini in 10 years of service. "Whatever it takes. Protect both my daughters. I have spent 30 years believing I only had one child to fight for. I will not lose either of them, now that I know the truth." Marco nodded once, and left the study at a run, already dialing Bianca's number with hands that, for the first time in a decade of dangerous work, were visibly shaking. Bianca had noticed the car on the access road twice that day, once in the early afternoon, a dark sedan idling near the tree line longer than any lost tourist would need to check a map, and again at dusk, the same vehicle parked a quarter-mile down the private lane, its engine off, no lights, no movement she could see from the cabin's front window. She told herself it was nothing. Told herself the isolation was making her paranoid, the way isolation sometimes did to people whose entire professional identity revolved around vigilance and pattern recognition. A mind trained to notice anomalies, now manufacturing them out of ordinary shadows. Then her phone rang, and it was Marco, and the moment she heard his voice, fast, clipped, stripped of every ounce of the careful calm he usually maintained, Bianca understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent a career reading crisis in other people's voices, that the car in the tree line had not been her imagination. "Bianca, listen to me carefully. I need you to leave the cabin right now. Don't pack anything. Don't turn on lights. Get to your car and drive to the second address I texted you 3 weeks ago, the one I told you to memorize and never write down. Do you remember it?" "Marco, what's happening? Do you remember it?" Yes, I remember it." "Go now.
I'm 40 minutes out. Call me the second you're in the car and moving, and stay on the line with me until you're on the highway." Bianca did not waste time asking further questions. A decade of emergency medicine had trained her to recognize the specific register of a voice that meant every second mattered, and she moved through the cabin with the same swift, economical efficiency she brought to a code blue, grabbing her keys, her phone, the small go-bag Marco had insisted she keep packed and ready from the very first day, and slipping out the cabin's back door into the deepening dark. The dark sedan's headlights flared to life the moment she reached her car, cutting across the gravel lot like accusation, and Bianca's heart slammed against her ribs as she understood, in the space of one terrified breath, that whoever had been watching the cabin had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment she tried to run. She threw the car into reverse, gravel spraying, and gunned it down the private lane toward the county road, the sedan's headlights swelling in her rear-view mirror with a speed that told her, unmistakably, that this was not a car built for anything as ordinary as sightseeing.
"I'm on the phone," she gasped, Marco's voice already in her ear, having redialed at the instant she'd hit the ignition. "Marco, there's a car following me. It's close. Don't look at it. Keep your eyes on the road. What's your position?" "County Road 9, heading toward the highway junction. There's a state trooper barracks 4 miles ahead on your right. I need you to drive there, not to the safe house. Drive straight into that parking lot and lay on your horn until someone comes out. Whoever's behind you won't risk exposure in front of law enforcement." Bianca pressed the accelerator to the floor, the old cabin road's curves screaming past in the darkness, the sedan's headlights never quite closing the distance, but never quite falling back either. A patient predator, content to let her exhaust herself before the kill. Her hands shook on the wheel, adrenaline and terror rendering her competent hands that had once calmly threaded 1-5 lines into the arms of dying strangers, suddenly clumsy with fear. The trooper barracks appeared exactly where Marco had promised. A low brick building lit up like a beacon against the surrounding dark, and Bianca swung into the lot so hard her tires shrieked, laying on her horn the moment she stopped moving, watching in her rearview mirror as the sedan slowed, hesitated at the mouth of the parking lot, and then continued past, unwilling, exactly as Marco had predicted, to risk the exposure of a confrontation in front of a building full of armed state police. A trooper emerged, hand near his holster, squinting at the erratically parked car, and the woman slumped over her steering wheel, sobbing with the particular relief that only arrives after terror has fully drained a body of its adrenaline. "Ma'am? You all right?" Bianca rolled down her window, still shaking, and found, absurdly, that her nurse's training reasserted itself even now. The automatic instinct to reassure, to manage another person's alarm, even in the middle of her own crisis. "I'm okay," she said. I think someone was following me. I need to call someone. Can I stay here a moment?" "Take all the time you need." She sat in the trooper barracks parking lot, engine idling, phone pressed to her ear, and listened to Marco's voice, finally, audibly, breaking with the fear he'd been suppressing for the last 20 minutes. "I'm coming to get you myself," he said. "I'm not putting you anywhere I haven't personally secured. Bianca, I need you to know something, and I need you to hear it before anything else happens tonight." "What?" "This was never really about Valeria," Marco said. "We think it might have always, from the very beginning, been about you." Enzo Contini's Miami condominium overlooked Biscayne Bay from the 14th floor. a sprawling wraparound terrace furnished with the particular ostentation of a man who had spent 20 years trying to convince himself that comfortable exile was the same thing as victory. He stood at the railing now, phone pressed to his ear, watching the lights of passing yachts carve slow gold lines across the dark water, and listened to the voice on the other end of the call describe, with evident frustration, the failure at the trooper barracks.
"She got away," the voice said. "The nurse. She made it to police before we could take her." Enzo's jaw tightened, though his voice, when he answered, remained perfectly level, the same practiced calm that had allowed him to sit across from his brother at family dinners for 20 years, nursing an old wound neither of them ever spoke aloud, while quietly building the patient architecture of revenge. "Then we adjust," he said. "Marco Vitale is smarter than I gave him credit for. He'll move her somewhere new within the hour. We wait, and we watch, and we find her again. Patience has gotten us this far. It will get us the rest of the way." He ended the call and stood a long moment at the railing, remembering, as he often did on nights like this one, the meeting 30 years ago, when his own father had passed over him for control of the family in favor of Raffaele, the older, more ruthless brother, the one their father had judged more suited to the particular cruelties the business required. Enzo had spent 2 decades in exile, telling himself he did not want the throne he had been denied. He had spent 2 decades lying. The plan had been simple in its origins and had grown over years of patient cultivation into something far more intricate. Use his old, quiet alliance with the Moretti family, built not from loyalty but from shared grievance against Raffaele's decades of territorial dominance, to fund an operation that would eliminate Valeria, the heir Raffaele had spent 30 years grooming to inherit everything Enzo believed should have been his from the start. But Enzo had also known something his brother did not, a secret he had purchased 4 years ago from a private investigator Raffaele had once carelessly hired and then dismissed without properly silencing. A private investigator who had discovered, in the course of digging through old hospital records on Raffaele's behalf, the existence of a second Contini daughter, secretly given away at birth and raised in blissful ignorance 400 miles from the empire that was rightfully hers. Enzo had recognized immediately the opportunity such knowledge represented. If Valeria died and no other blood heir existed, control of the empire would fracture into a war among capos and cousins that Enzo, patient and well-positioned, believed he could ultimately win. But if a second heir existed, one raised entirely outside the family's discipline, malleable, uncorrupted by 30 years of Raffaele's training, desperate for family and love and belonging in the specific way that only a woman who'd spent her whole life feeling like something was missing could be desperate, then Enzo would not need to fight a war at all. He would simply need to become the loving uncle who welcomed her home, who guided her gently, who made himself indispensable to a frightened, grieving young woman suddenly thrust into a world of violence she had never been trained to survive. He would not need to seize the throne. He would simply need to sit beside it, whispering counsel into the ear of a puppet who trusted him, until the puppet's strings were entirely his to pull. It was, Enzo thought, watching the yacht lights slide across the black water, an elegant plan, far more elegant than his brother had ever given him credit for being capable of. His phone buzzed again. A text from his contact inside the Ricci family, one of several quiet loyalists Enzo had spent years cultivating within his brother's own household. patient investments finally coming due. Vitale is moving the nurse to a new location tonight. We have eyes on the highway cameras. We'll have a fix within the hour. Enzo smiled, thin and cold, and typed back a single word. Good. He poured himself a second scotch and returned to the railing, already composing in his mind the gentle, avuncular speech he would give when he finally met his hidden grandniece. The warm, welcoming words of a man who understood exactly how starved she must be for family, for belonging, for someone who would love her not despite her ignorance of this dangerous world, but precisely because of it, because ignorance made her pliable in a way that Valeria, damn her, trained too well by Raffaele's own hand, had never been. He did not yet know that Valeria herself had already discovered the truth of his involvement, a thread Marco's investigation was pulling tighter with every passing hour, or that his own carefully cultivated loyalists inside the Contini household had begun, in the wake of Tommaso Ricci's suspicious death, to grow nervous enough that one of them might, given the right pressure, break entirely. Enzo Contini believed himself, standing on his 14th floor terrace above Biscayne Bay, to be a man on the verge of a patient, elegant triumph 30 years in the making. He was, in fact, precisely 11 days from losing everything. The new safe house Marco secured for Bianca was a converted farmhouse 2 hours in the opposite direction, owned by a retired Contini soldier who had left the life 15 years ago and asked, in exchange for the use of his property, only that his name never appear in anything connected to the family again. Marco drove Bianca there himself, refusing to delegate her safety to anyone else, and stayed the night on the farmhouse's worn living room couch, weapon within reach, sleeping in the particular shallow, alert half-rest of a man who had spent a decade training his body never to fully surrender to unconsciousness while on duty. In the morning, over coffee, neither of them had the appetite to drink. Bianca finally asked the question that had been building in her chest since the trooper barracks parking lot. "Tell me everything. All of it. I'm done being protected from information, Marco. If someone wants to use me as a chess piece in this family's war, I deserve to understand the board." So Marco told her. About Enzo, about the decades-old grievance, about the elegant, patient cruelty of a plan that had never truly been about eliminating Valeria at all, but about controlling whoever remained standing when the dust settled. He told her about Don Raffaele's fear, raw and unfamiliar, on a man who had built his entire identity around never showing fear. He told her, finally, the thing he had been avoiding since the moment he'd confirmed his suspicions in a Chicago apartment 4 weeks ago. "I know Valeria's identity has been exposed to me," he said. "I confronted her 3 days ago. I know who she really is, underneath the disguise." Bianca went very still, coffee mug halfway to her lips. And Marco met her eyes and found, to his own surprise, that he could not bring himself to lie to this woman who had trusted him with 8 months of uncomplicated love, even though the truth would cost him something he suspected he could never fully repair. "I fell in love with her," he said quietly. "Not instead of you. Somehow, impossibly, alongside the love I already had for you. Tangled up in it so completely, I don't know how to separate the two anymore." I know how that sounds. I know what it costs you to hear it. I'm telling you anyway, because you asked me for the truth, and I promised myself, whatever else happened in this mess, that I would never lie to you,
the way everyone else in this story has lied to everyone else. The silence that followed stretched long enough that Marco began to believe she might simply stand, walk out of the farmhouse, and never speak to him again. A consequence he understood he had earned, whatever grief it would cost him. Instead, Bianca set down her coffee mug with the careful precision of a woman managing her own hands through shock, and asked, in a voice stripped of anger, stripped even of grief, carrying instead a strange, exhausted clarity. "Does she love you back?" "I think so. I think she's been fighting it since before either of us understood what was happening." Bianca nodded slowly, staring at some middle distance past Marco's shoulder. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular weary wisdom of a woman who spent her professional life helping other people survive impossible things. "I spent 8 months loving a man who kept the most important part of his life a complete secret from me," she said. "Not because you're cruel, Marco. I understand now why you couldn't tell me. I understand the danger. I understand the walls you had to build to survive that world. But I spent 8 months building a life with a man I only half knew. And now I find out my own twin sister, a woman I've known for exactly 1 month, has fallen into the space I thought belonged to me." She laughed, short and humorless. "I should hate both of you. I keep waiting to feel it." "Do you?" "No." The word came out soft, almost surprised at itself. "I keep thinking about her, in that kitchen, telling me she'd never had the luxury of assuming people meant well. I keep thinking about 30 years of a life built entirely on violence and control, and how exhausting that must be. And how strange it is that the first time she got to be soft with someone, it happened to be with the one man I'd already given my heart to." She met Marco's eyes, and something in her gaze had shifted, grief transmuting slowly into something closer to grace. "I don't think I can be angry at either of you for falling in love in the middle of a nightmare neither of you chose. I think I'm just grieving something I thought I had, that maybe I never fully had at all." "Bianca, don't," she said gently, holding up a hand. "Don't apologize again. I need time, Marco. I need to figure out what I actually feel, once the fear and the adrenaline settle down enough to let me feel anything clearly. But I'm not going to pretend I hate my own sister for finding something real in the middle of all this. Life is too short, and I've watched too many people die holding on to grudges they never got the chance to release." She stood, gathering the coffee mugs, her hands finally steady. "Right now, I need you to focus on keeping both of us alive. We can sort out the rest of it once we're not actively being hunted." Marco watched her walk toward the farmhouse kitchen with her particular unhurried grace, a woman choosing compassion in the middle of her own devastation, because compassion was, quite simply, the only language she had ever fully known how to speak. And felt something in his chest crack open, with a grief and a gratitude so tangled together he could not have separated them if his life depended on it. Outside, unnoticed by either of them, a car idled at the end of the long gravel drive, its driver patiently reporting the farmhouse's location back to a man on a 14th-floor terrace in Miami, who had, despite Marco's best efforts, already found them again. Enzo Contini arrived at the farmhouse 2 days later, alone, unarmed, in a car that announced no threat at all, a gesture Marco recognized immediately as its own kind of calculated menace, the confidence of a man who believed himself, correctly or not, entirely safe from retaliation. "I've come to speak with my grandniece," Enzo said, standing in the farmhouse's gravel drive, with his hands visibly empty, a warm, avuncular smile arranged carefully across a face that shared, Marco noted with cold recognition, the same fine bone structure as Don Raffaele, the same dark eyes, softened here into something meant to read as harmless. "You've come to threaten a woman who has nothing to do with any of this," Marco said, positioning his body between Enzo and the farmhouse door, hand resting near his holster in a gesture that required no further explanation. "I've come to offer her a family she never knew she had. Surely that's not a crime." Enzo's smile did not waver. "I understand you've grown fond of her, Marco. Fond enough to risk everything protecting her. I respect that. But you and I both know you can't protect her from me forever. Better she hears the truth from family than continues living in fear of a threat she doesn't understand." Behind Marco, the farmhouse door opened, and Bianca stepped out onto the porch. Against every instinct Marco possessed, against his sharp, urgent whisper for her to stay inside. Because Bianca Ferro had spent a decade of her professional life walking toward frightening things rather than away from them, and some deep, immovable part of her character refused, even now, to hide from a conversation that concerned her own life. "I'll speak to him," she said. "Bianca, no. He came unarmed, in broad daylight, to a house he could have simply had watched and waited to strike. He wants something from me that violence can't get him." She met Marco's eyes, steady despite the visible tremor in her hands. "Let me hear what it is." They sat on the farmhouse porch, an absurd tableau. The exiled patriarch, the compassionate nurse, and the loyal enforcer standing sentinel a few feet away, weapon never leaving his hand, while Enzo delivered with practiced warmth the speech he had composed weeks earlier on his Miami terrace. "You have every right to hate this family," he said. "You were taken from your mother's arms because of a superstition older than any of us, raised in ignorance, while your sister inherited everything that should, by rights, have belonged to both of you equally. I understand that grief, Bianca, better than you might imagine. I too was denied what should have been mine 30 years ago by my own brother's ambition." "You're the one who tried to have Valeria killed," Bianca said flatly, watching him with the steady, assessing gaze she had once reserved for triage patients whose injuries did not match their stated symptoms. Enzo's smile finally flickered, just slightly. "I took steps to correct an imbalance that has poisoned this family for 3 decades. I won't pretend those steps were gentle. This life rarely permits gentleness. But I want you to understand something, Bianca. I have never wished you harm. Quite the opposite. I see in you an opportunity this family has never had, a chance to build something new, unpoisoned by the violence that shaped your sister, guided by someone who understands both worlds and wants, more than anything, to help you find your footing in this one." "You want a puppet," Bianca said, quiet and clear. "You didn't come here for family. You came here because you think a woman raised in ignorance would be easier to control than a woman raised to rule." The porch went very still, Enzo's carefully constructed warmth cracking for just a moment into something colder and more calculating underneath. "I came here," he said, voice dropping, "to offer you a choice you would not otherwise have. Come with me, willingly,
and I will ensure your sister's death is quick and painless when it finally happens. A mercy, given the alternative options available to me. Refuse, and I will be forced to conclude you've chosen her side over your own safety, and I will treat you accordingly. His smile returned, thin and cold. I would prefer the gentler path, Bianca, truly. But I did not survive 30 years of exile by allowing sentiment to interfere with necessity. Marco's weapon was in his hand before Enzo finished speaking, though the old man did not so much as flinch, confident in whatever protection he believed his unarmed public approach afforded him. "You'll leave now," Marco said, "or I will end 30 years of patience in about 4 seconds. Family politics be damned." Enzo rose from the porch chair with unhurried dignity, straightening his jacket, and offered Bianca one final appraising look. Not quite affection, not quite threat, something colder and more calculating than either. "Think carefully about what I've offered," he said. "You have until the end of the week. After that, I'm afraid, my patience runs out entirely, and matters proceed without the courtesy of choice." He nodded once, almost pleasant, and walked back to his car, leaving Bianca standing on the farmhouse porch with her hands shaking and her nurse's training screaming at her to slow her own racing heartbeat before it became a genuine medical concern. "He'll kill me if I refuse him," Bianca said quietly, once the car had disappeared down the gravel drive. "And he'll kill Valeria regardless, whatever I choose. He's not actually offering me anything, is he? He's just deciding which of us dies first." Marco holstered his weapon, hands still shaking with adrenaline, and pulled her into an embrace that had nothing left in it of romantic complication, only the raw, desperate solidarity of two people who had just looked directly at the shape of the danger closing in around them. "We're not letting either of you die," he said, fierce and low against her hair. "I don't care what it costs. We end this before the end of the week." Valeria arrived at the farmhouse 18 hours later, having insisted over Marco's strenuous objections about operational security that she needed to see her sister in person before any plan against Enzo moved forward. She stepped out of the car into the grey morning light and found Bianca already waiting on the porch, arms crossed, watching her twin approach with an expression Valeria could not immediately read. "He came here," Bianca said without preamble. "Your uncle. He offered me a choice between joining him and dying alongside you." Valeria's face went pale beneath its careful composure. "I'm so sorry. This was never supposed to touch you. I told myself when I first came to Chicago that I was protecting you by keeping you hidden. I never imagined he already knew you existed. He's known for years, apparently, long before either of us knew about each other." Bianca's arms remained crossed, a posture of protection rather than hostility, Valeria realized, watching her sister's face carefully. "I'm not angry at you for that, Valeria. None of this is anything either of us chose. But I need you to know that Marco told me everything about the two of you." The silence that followed carried the particular weight of a confession already delivered once, now hanging unresolved between the two women who had built, in barely more than a month, something that felt, despite everything, genuinely like sisterhood. "I never meant for it to happen," Valeria said quietly. "I know that doesn't make it hurt less.
I made you a promise in your kitchen, and I broke it within a month, and I have spent every day since hating myself for exactly that. Do you love him? The question landed simply, without accusation, and Valeria found she owed her sister nothing less than complete honesty in response. Yes, she said. I think I've loved him for 3 years, if I'm honest with myself, and spent every one of those years telling myself it was simply professional respect, because the alternative terrified me more than any assassin ever has. I never intended to act on it. I never intended any of this. Bianca nodded slowly, processing, her arms finally uncrossing as something in her posture softened. I spent this last week thinking I would hate you both, she said. I kept waiting for the anger to arrive properly, the way it's supposed to when someone takes something that belongs to you. But it never fully came, Valeria. I think some part of me has known, since the moment I opened my apartment door and saw your face, that we were never meant to be split apart the way our grandmother split us. I think whatever belongs to you has always, in some strange way, belonged partly to me too, and whatever belongs to me belongs partly to you. I don't know how to hate you for falling in love with a man I loved first, when some part of me feels like loving him was never entirely separate between us to begin with. She managed a small, exhausted laugh. That probably sounds insane. It sounds, Valeria said, throat tight, like the truest thing anyone has said to me in 30 years. They embraced on the farmhouse porch, 2 women wearing identical faces and carrying, finally, identical grief and identical grace. And when they separated, Bianca's expression had firmed into something new. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but a shared determination that mattered, in that moment, considerably more. Whatever happens with the 2 of you, we'll figure it out afterward, when we're not actively being hunted by a man who wants to use one of us as a puppet and murder the other, Bianca said. Right now, I want to help stop him. I'm done being protected from information. I'm done being the fragile, ordinary sister everyone tiptoes around. Tell me the actual plan. Marco, who had been standing silently near the door throughout the exchange, stepped forward, visibly relieved to move the conversation towards something actionable. Enzo believes Bianca might still choose to join him, he said. That's our opening. If Bianca agrees to a meeting, appearing willing to consider his offer, we can lure him somewhere we control, somewhere Don Raffaele's remaining loyal capos can move against him without a public confrontation that draws federal attention. It's dangerous. It requires Bianca to convince a man who's spent 30 years reading people that she's genuinely considering betraying her own sister. I can do that, Bianca said immediately. It's not a small risk. I spend my professional life convincing frightened, dying people that everything is going to be all right, when I genuinely don't know if it will be, Bianca said. I think I can manage convincing one bitter old man that I'm tempted by his offer, if it means ending this before he decides to kill either of us, regardless of what I choose. Valeria looked between her sister and the man they both, in some tangled, unresolved way, loved, and felt something settle in her chest that she recognized with some surprise as hope. Fragile, unearned, but real. Then we plan, she said, all 3 of us, together. Outside the farmhouse windows, the grey morning was beginning, slowly, to burn off into something clearer, and none of the 3 people gathered inside allowed themselves to name the fact that they had, in that moment, become something none of them had expected. Not an heir and her bodyguard and her hidden twin, but three people bound by love and blood and danger, in a configuration none of the old superstitions had ever accounted for. They chose the old Contini boathouse for the meeting, the same boathouse where Tommaso Ricci had been captured after the assassination attempt, a location Marco selected deliberately for the symbolic weight it carried, though he kept that particular reasoning to himself. Don Raffaele, informed of the plan through an encrypted call that left the old man's voice tight with a fear he no longer bothered hiding, mobilized the 6 capos whose loyalty had survived 3 decades unquestioned, positioning them in the surrounding boathouses and along the marina's tree line hours before the scheduled meeting. Bianca made the call to Enzo herself, her voice carrying the particular controlled tremor of a woman genuinely weighing an impossible choice, a performance built entirely from the real fear she had felt on his farmhouse porch, redirected now toward a purpose. "I want to hear more about what you're offering," she said. "Not because I trust you, because I'm frightened. And you're the only person who's offered me a way out of being frightened."
"Wise girl," Enzo said, satisfaction audible even through the phone line. "Come to the marina tomorrow evening, alone. We'll talk properly, without your sister's enforcer hovering over every word." Alone proved predictably to be a lie on both sides. Enzo arrived at the boathouse with 4 armed men positioned in the surrounding dark, believing himself protected by superior numbers against whatever token resistance a frightened nurse and a single loyal bodyguard might muster. He did not know, walking down the weathered dock toward the boathouse's lit interior, that Don Raffaele's 6 capos had spent the previous 3 hours quietly neutralizing his men one by one, using the particular silent efficiency the family reserved for matters requiring absolute discretion. Bianca stood inside the boathouse alone, exactly as instructed, her heart hammering so hard she feared Enzo would hear it the moment he entered, though her face, she had spent a decade learning to control her face in front of dying strangers, remained perfectly, deceptively calm. "You came," Enzo said, stepping inside, his warm, avuncular smile firmly back in place. "I confess, I wasn't certain you would." "I told you. I'm frightened." Bianca let the tremor show in her hands, genuine fear repurposed into performance. "I don't want to die for a sister I've known a month, Enzo. I don't want to die at all. Tell me exactly what you're offering, and tell me I can trust it." Enzo moved closer, and for a moment Bianca genuinely believed he might embrace her, this stranger performing an uncle's affection with the same practiced ease he'd used to arrange an assassination. "I'm offering you everything," he said. "A family, a fortune, protection. All I ask in return is loyalty. Loyalty to the man who chooses to give you what your sister's father never offered." "And if I said yes right now? What happens to Valeria?" Something flickered across Enzo's face, not hesitation exactly, but the brief calculation of a man deciding how much truth a useful puppet actually needed. "Valeria has made her choice already, in choosing her father's world over any accommodation with mine. Her fate was decided the moment she was born the heir instead of the exile." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer that matters." His warmth cooled, finally, into something closer to the truth beneath it. "She dies, Bianca. Tonight, if I have my way, though your sister's protector has made that considerably harder than it should have been. You, however,
You have a future ahead of you, if you're wise enough to choose it. It was, Marco thought, listening through the wire concealed beneath Bianca's collar from his position in the boathouse's shadowed loft above, precisely the confession they needed. Enzo's own voice, clear and unambiguous, confirming an intent to murder his own grandniece in front of a recording device Don Raffaele's men had rigged hours earlier. "I think," Valeria said, stepping out of the shadows at the boathouse's rear entrance, flanked by two of her father's capos, her voice carrying none of the fear she had performed for 30 years and every ounce of the authority she had been born to wield, "that you've said quite enough, uncle." Enzo turned, his composure finally fully cracking as he understood the trap that had closed around him. Bianca's fear a performance, the boathouse a stage, his own men neutralized somewhere in the marina's dark before he'd even reached the dock. "You clever girls," he said, and for the first time in the entire encounter, something like genuine respect moved across his features, twisted immediately into fury. "Both of you. I underestimated you both." "You underestimated everyone," Don Raffaele said, stepping into the boathouse's lit interior from the shadows behind his daughter, his voice carrying 30 years of buried grief, finally given permission to surface as rage. "Your own brother, who gave you a comfortable exile instead of the execution our own father would have ordered. Your own niece, whom you tried to murder at her own birthday celebration. And a woman you never even knew existed until 4 years ago, who has spent her entire life learning exactly the kind of compassionate courage that lets a person walk into a trap wearing a smile." Enzo's eyes moved between his brother, his niece, and his grandniece. 3 faces bound by blood he had spent 30 years believing should have granted him power over all of them, and found, in that final moment before Don Raffaele's men moved to restrain him, nothing left to say that might change the outcome he had spent 3 decades trying to avoid. "I only wanted what was mine," he said quietly as the capos closed around him. "Nothing was ever yours," Don Raffaele said. "That was always the tragedy of you, Enzo. You spent 30 years grieving a birthright you were never actually owed." The family council convened 2 nights later in the same ballroom where the assassination attempt had begun. The shattered chandeliers replaced, the bullet-scarred east wall repaired, every visible trace of that terrible night erased with the particular efficient thoroughness that money and discretion could purchase. Don Raffaele sat at the head of the long table, flanked by the capos whose loyalty had proven, when it mattered, unshakable, and across from him sat the 6 other family heads, whose alliance or enmity would determine whether the Contini organization survived this scandal intact. Enzo was not present. He would never be present at anything again, a fact the assembled families understood without needing it spoken aloud, the particular silence surrounding his absence carrying its own complete explanation. "The matter of my brother's betrayal has been resolved," Don Raffaele said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had spent 30 years building an empire and nearly lost everything to a grievance he had never fully understood the depth of. "What remains is the matter of succession, which some of you have raised concerns about, given the unusual circumstances that have come to light. Salvatore Moretti, seated near the far end of the table, leaned forward with the particular careful diplomacy of a man whose family had been unwittingly implicated in a scheme he insisted, with evident sincerity, he had known nothing about beyond the vague financial arrangement his father's old associate had proposed. "With respect, Don Raffaele," Moretti said, "the families need clarity. There are two daughters now, where we believed there was one. Some among us wonder which of them will actually inherit, and whether the other represents a continuing vulnerability, a second target, a second point of leverage for any future enemy who learns what your brother learned." Valeria, seated at her father's right hand for the first time as herself rather than the disguise she had worn for weeks, met Moretti's gaze without flinching. "I will inherit," she said. "That was decided before either of us was born, and nothing about discovering my sister changes the discipline I've spent 30 years building for exactly this responsibility. But I want every family at this table to understand something clearly. My sister is not a vulnerability to be managed. She is protected the same as I am protected, permanently, unconditionally, and any enemy who thinks otherwise will learn precisely how thoroughly this family defends its own." Bianca, seated beside her twin in a role neither of them had fully defined yet, watched the assembled men process this declaration, and found herself, despite everything, despite a month of fear and betrayal and grief, feeling something like pride in the woman beside her. A woman who had spent her entire life training for exactly this moment and had, in the crucible of the last 6 weeks, become someone Bianca genuinely respected rather than simply, reluctantly, loved as family. "And what of the nurse herself?" asked another capo, an older man Bianca did not recognize. "Does she intend to remain part of this world, or return to her ordinary life in Chicago?" The question hung in the ballroom's expensive air, and Bianca understood, watching every face at the table turn toward her, that her answer mattered more than perhaps any single choice she had made in the 6 weeks since a stranger with her own face had knocked on her apartment door. "I intend," she said slowly, "to return to my life in Chicago. My patients need me. The work I do there matters to me in a way I don't think any of you would fully understand, sitting in this room built on an entirely different set of values." She glanced at Valeria, and something passed between the twins that needed no words. "But I don't intend to disappear from my sister's life, the way our grandmother once tried to make certain we never found each other at all. Whatever this family is, whatever it costs, Valeria is my sister. I won't be erased from her life again, and I won't allow her to be erased from mine." Don Raffaele, watching his 2 daughters, one raised for this exact moment, one who had walked into it entirely unprepared and somehow risen to meet it with a grace even he had not anticipated, felt something shift in his chest that he recognized, with some surprise, as genuine hope, for the first time since the chandelier had shattered above his ballroom 6 weeks earlier. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice carrying the particular finality that ended council meetings and, occasionally, entire family wars. "Valeria Contini remains heir to everything I have built. Bianca Ferro remains under this family's full protection wherever she chooses to live her life, and any enemy who threatens her will face consequences identical to those threatening Valeria herself. The curse my mother believed in has cost this family 30 years and very nearly cost 2 daughters their lives. I will not honor it with another day of separation." The assembled families murmured their acknowledgement, the particular ritual consensus that bound organizations like this one together, and as the council dispersed into the ballroom's expensive quiet, Valeria reached beneath the table and found her sister's hand, holding it the way she had once, as an infant 30 years ago, been prevented from ever holding it at all. "We did it," Bianca whispered. "We're not finished," Valeria said quietly, watching Marco across the ballroom, his eyes already finding hers the way they always did, the unresolved weight of everything still standing between the three of them, settling back into the room now that the immediate danger had passed. "There's still Marco. There's still us." They met the following afternoon in the estate's private garden, the three of them, at Bianca's own insistence. She had told Marco and Valeria both, in a phone call the previous night, that she refused to let the question of their tangled hearts fester unspoken any longer, that she had spent enough of her life managing other people's crises to know that unaddressed wounds only festered into something worse than the original pain. "I've had 2 days to think about this properly," Bianca said, once the three of them were settled on a stone bench beneath a flowering pear tree, the late afternoon light gilding everything in the particular gold that made the Contini estate look, despite its violent history, genuinely beautiful. "And I want to say some things, and I need both of you to actually listen instead of rushing to apologize, because I think we're all a little exhausted with apologies at this point." Marco and Valeria exchanged a glance, and both nodded, chastened. "I loved you first, Marco," Bianca said, turning to him. "That's true, and it will always be true, and I'm not going to pretend the last 6 weeks haven't hurt in ways I'm still working through. But I've also had time to really examine what we had, honestly, without the fear of losing you clouding my judgment, and I think what we had was real and good, and also incomplete in a way neither of us fully admitted to ourselves. You never let me all the way in, Marco, not because you didn't want to, but because you couldn't, not without endangering both of us. There was always a wall." Marco's jaw tightened, but he did not interrupt, holding himself to the promise he'd made to simply listen. "And Valeria," Bianca continued, turning to her twin, "I watched you fall in love with him in real time, in my own apartment, wearing my own face. And I think what I witnessed was something neither of you chose, and both of you fought against as hard as you could. I think you fell for each other despite every reason not to, which is a very different thing from betrayal, even though it felt like betrayal to me at first." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I've decided something, and I want to say it clearly, once, and then I want us to never revisit this particular conversation again. I'm releasing you both from whatever guilt you're carrying. Not because it doesn't matter that you fell in love while I was 2 hours away, trusting both of you completely, but because holding on to that grief serves nothing except making 3 people miserable who have already survived enough misery for 1 lifetime." "Bianca," Marco started, but she held up a hand, not finished. "Let me finish. I've thought about this carefully, and I've realized something about myself in the process. I don't think I need Marco the way I thought I did 6 weeks ago. I think I needed, desperately, to be truly known by someone. And Marco gave me 8 months of real, if incomplete, love, and I'm grateful for every day of it. But I've spent this past month discovering I have a sister who understands parts of me no romantic partner ever could. A woman who shares my exact face and, it turns out, shares something even deeper than that. A way of loving fiercely, despite everything the world has done to make fierce love dangerous. I don't need to keep Marco to feel whole, Valeria. I think I finally understand that. Valeria's eyes filled, and she reached for her sister's hand without hesitation. The gesture no longer strange or unfamiliar the way it had been 6 weeks earlier, but something that felt now entirely natural. "I want you both to be happy," Bianca said, her voice thick but steady. "I want that more than I want to hold on to a relationship that was, if I'm honest with myself, already incomplete before any of this began. So I'm asking you both, formally, with a clear heart and no lingering resentment I'm aware of, stop torturing yourselves over this. Love each other properly, the way you clearly already do. I'll find my own way forward, and I have a feeling, call it nurse's intuition, that my way forward looks a great deal like my ordinary life in Chicago, surrounded by patients who need me and a sister who, I hope, will visit often enough that distance never again becomes the same kind of separation our grandmother once forced on us." The garden went quiet, the late afternoon light shifting slowly through the pear blossoms, and Marco finally spoke, his voice rough, with an emotion he rarely permitted himself to show. "I don't deserve this kind of grace," he said. "Either of you."
"Probably not," Bianca said, and managed for the first time in weeks a genuine, unguarded laugh. "But I've learned something in a decade of emergency medicine, Marco. People rarely get what they deserve, good or bad. They get what happens to them, and then they choose what to do with it. I'm choosing generosity because the alternative is bitterness, and I've watched too many patients let bitterness eat them alive to choose it for myself." Valeria, still holding her sister's hand, reached with her free one for Marco's, completing a small circle between the three of them beneath the flowering tree, and felt, for the first time since the chandelier had shattered above her father's ballroom, something that might, eventually, given enough time and enough healing, become genuine peace.
"Thank you," she whispered to her sister, "for all of it. For a lifetime I never got to have with you, and for a grace I don't think I would have offered if our positions were reversed." "That's exactly why they weren't reversed," Bianca said gently. "You needed to be the one who learned to be soft. I needed to be the one who learned to survive something hard. I think, somehow, we ended up exactly where we needed to be." 3 months passed, and the Contini Empire settled slowly into a new equilibrium. Valeria, fully installed as heir apparent, her father's health improving now that the immediate threat had passed, the 6 families having accepted, with varying degrees of genuine warmth, the new configuration of power that excluded Enzo's faction entirely. Salvatore Moretti, eager to distance his own family from the scandal, had proven an unexpectedly useful ally in the transition, and Valeria found herself, to her own surprise, genuinely skilled at the delicate diplomacy her father had spent 30 years perfecting. She had also, in the month since the confrontation at the boathouse, begun quietly restructuring pieces of the family's business in ways her father would never have considered, diverting resources toward the kind of legitimate community investment that had, she realized with some private irony, been modelled for her entirely by 6 weeks spent watching her sister care for strangers without expectation of anything in return. She funded a wing at Mercy General. She established a scholarship anonymously, for children who had lost parents to the particular kind of violence her own family had specialized in for a century. She did not tell her father the full extent of it, understanding that Don Rafaele's acceptance of change had limits, but she pursued it quietly anyway, a small private rebellion against 30 years of training that had taught her mercy was a luxury the family could not afford. Bianca returned to Chicago and to Mercy General, where Danny and her other colleagues accepted her vague explanation of a family emergency without pressing for details, relieved simply to have her back on the floor. She resumed the rhythm of catastrophe and grace that had always defined her working life, and found, to her quiet surprise, that the 6 weeks of danger and revelation had not diminished her capacity for compassion, but had, if anything, deepened it. She understood loss now, and fear, and the particular vertigo of discovering your whole life rested on foundations you'd never fully examined, in ways that made her better, not worse, at sitting with frightened strangers in their own worst moments. She and Valeria spoke by phone most weeks, and visited when the demands of Valeria's new responsibilities allowed it, building slowly, patiently, the relationship neither of them had been permitted as children. Sisters learning each other in adulthood instead of infancy, discovering that some bonds, however violently interrupted, found their way back toward completion anyway. Marco divided his time in those first months between his ongoing duties protecting Valeria and the more complicated question of what, exactly, he owed to a woman he had genuinely loved and genuinely hurt. He drove to Chicago twice in the first 6 weeks, not to rekindle anything romantic, but to sit with Bianca over coffee and simply talk, honestly, about the strange, tangled year that had reshaped all 3 of their lives, and found each time that the conversation left him lighter rather than heavier. A friendship emerging from the wreckage of a romance that had never quite been built to last. "You look happy," Bianca told him on the second visit, watching him across her small kitchen table, the same table where the whole impossible story had begun. "I am," Marco admitted. "Guiltily happy some days, but happy." "Don't feel guilty," Bianca said. "I meant what I said in that garden. I want this for both of you. I've made my peace with it, mostly, and the days I haven't fully made peace with it, I go to work and hold someone's hand through something worse than heartbreak, and it puts things back into perspective fairly quickly." "Have you met anyone?" Bianca smiled, small and genuine. "There's a trauma surgeon, new to the hospital. He asked me to dinner last week." She shrugged, a little self-conscious. "I said yes. It's early, but it felt good to say yes to something uncomplicated for once." "I'm glad," Marco said, and meant it entirely. He returned to the Contini estate that evening to find Valeria waiting on the terrace where, months earlier, the first gunshot of this entire ordeal had shattered a chandelier and set 3 lives spinning into each other's orbit. She had changed out of her business attire into something simpler and stood at the railing, watching the same dark water Valeria had watched from her bedroom window the night this whole story began, though something in her posture now carried none of the isolated grief it once had. "How was Chicago?" she asked. "Good. She's seeing someone, a surgeon." Valeria's face showed genuine relief, the last thread of guilt she'd carried since the garden conversation, finally, visibly loosening. "I'm glad. I've worried some nights that we took something from her she'll never fully recover." "I don't think we took it," Marco said, coming to stand beside her at the railing. I think, somehow, impossibly, all three of us ended up exactly where we were supposed to be. I don't know how to explain it better than that.
It doesn't make sense given everything that happened, but it's true anyway. Valeria leaned into him, his arm coming around her with the easy familiarity of months rather than weeks, and together they watched the dark water. Two people who had built something real out of the wreckage of a deception neither of them had chosen, but both of them, ultimately, could not bring themselves to regret. My father wants to announce our engagement at the Christmas gala, Valeria said quietly. If you're ready for that particular spotlight. Marco's arm tightened around her. I've spent 3 years standing in your shadow, protecting you from the spotlight. I think I can manage standing beside you in it for once. Even knowing what standing beside a Contini actually costs? Especially knowing that, Marco said.
I've seen the cost up close for 3 years, Valeria. I'm choosing it anyway. That's the whole point. The Contini Christmas Gala had always been, in Valeria's memory, an occasion of glittering obligation rather than genuine joy. 300 guests performing celebration while calculating quietly the shifting balance of power the evening's seating arrangements and toasts might reveal. This year, standing in the same ballroom where an assassin's bullet had once shattered a chandelier above her head, Valeria found herself, for the first time in her adult life, actually looking forward to the evening ahead. Bianca had flown in 2 days earlier, bringing with her the trauma surgeon, David, quietly kind, entirely unbothered by the strange Mafia-adjacent circumstances of his girlfriend's biological family. A man who had apparently decided, in the practical way of someone who spent his career making split-second decisions under pressure, that loving Bianca meant accepting the full, complicated shape of her life without requiring it to make complete sense. You clean up well, Bianca told her twin, adjusting the shoulder of Valeria's gown in the same third-floor bedroom where this entire story had begun. The two women's faces reflected together in the mirror for the first time since the chaos of that terrible birthday night, though the reflection now held none of the isolated grief that had defined it then. So do you. Valeria studied their twin reflections, identical bone structure, identical dark eyes, and yet, she thought, entirely distinguishable now to anyone who knew to look. Two women who had grown, in the year since discovering each other, into fully separate people, rather than mirrored halves of some singular whole.
Thank you for coming. I know this world isn't easy for you to stand inside, even for one night. It's easier than it used to be, Bianca said. And it's worth it, to watch my sister marry the man she loves in front of everyone who once tried to keep the two of us apart forever. She smiled, warm and unguarded. Nonna Assunta's curse died the exact moment we found each other, Valeria. I believe that completely. Whatever power that old superstition once had over this family, it couldn't survive the two of us actually meeting. The ceremony itself, held in the same garden beneath the flowering pear tree where the three of them had once untangled the wreckage of their intertwined hearts, was small and quiet by Contini standards, only immediate family and the closest, most trusted capos. Don Raffaele, walking his daughter down a simple aisle of white chairs, with tears openly visible on a face that had spent 30 years disciplining itself against exactly this kind of unguarded emotion. Marco waited at the end of the aisle in a dark suit, watching Valeria approach with an expression that held, Bianca thought, watching from her seat beside David, absolutely everything a person could hope to see on the face of someone about to marry them. Desire and reverence, and a fierce, protective tenderness that had clearly only deepened across the year since a Chicago apartment had first revealed the truth neither man nor woman had been prepared to survive.
"I, Marco, take you, Valeria," he said when the moment came, his voice steady despite the visible emotion beneath it, "not as the heir I was assigned to protect, but as the woman I chose to love once I finally understood who you actually were, beneath every mask this family, or your own fear, ever asked you to wear. I promise to keep choosing you every day exactly as you are." Valeria's own vows, when she spoke them, carried the particular weight of a woman who had spent 30 years believing love was a weakness her family could not afford, finally, fully disproven. "I, Valeria, take you, Marco, understanding now that the softness I once believed was a luxury I couldn't afford is actually the truest strength I possess," she said. "You saw past every wall I built to survive this family, and you loved what you found underneath, and you never once asked me to be anyone other than exactly who I am. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of a love like that." The reception that followed filled the ballroom with a warmth Valeria had never once associated with this particular room across 30 years of formal, obligatory celebrations. And near midnight, standing at the edge of the dance floor with her sister beside her, watching Marco laugh at something Don Raffaele had said, Valeria felt the old grief of her isolated childhood settle, finally, into something like completion. "Do you ever think about what our lives would have looked like," Bianca asked quietly, "if Nonna Assunta had never separated us? If we'd grown up together, in this house or in mine?" "Every day," Valeria admitted. "But I've also come to believe something strange this past year. I don't think I would have become the woman capable of loving Marco properly if I hadn't spent 30 years learning, the hard way, exactly what I was missing. And I don't think you would have become the woman capable of walking calmly into that boathouse trap if you hadn't spent 30 years building the particular fearless compassion your ordinary life required of you. I think, somehow, impossibly, we needed the separation to become the specific people who could finally survive finding each other." Bianca considered this, watching David approach across the ballroom with 2 glasses of champagne, an easy smile on his face that had, over the past year, become genuinely familiar to her. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe we just make sense of terrible things after the fact, because the alternative is admitting how much was simply stolen from us for no good reason at all." She squeezed her sister's hand. "Either way, I'm glad we found each other, however late, however strange the reason." "Me too," Valeria said, and meant it entirely, watching her husband cross the ballroom floor toward her, the last shadow of the curse that had once split her family in two, finally, fully, dissolved into nothing more than an old story that no longer had any power over the people it had once tried to destroy. A year after the wedding, Valeria stood again at the window of her third-floor bedroom. Hers and Marco's now, the room reconfigured, softened, filled with photographs that had never been permitted to exist in this house before.
Bianca and David's engagement announcement, framed beside a picture of the twin sisters as grown women standing together on a Chicago sidewalk, faces identical and expressions entirely their own, captured on one of Valeria's increasingly frequent visits north. She was 6 months pregnant, her hand resting unconsciously against the curve of her stomach, and she watched the same dark water she had watched the night of her 30th birthday, though the woman looking out at it now bore only a distant relation to the isolated, armoured heir who had stood at this window a year and a half earlier, waiting for a birthday party that would detonate the only life she had ever known. Her father had died peacefully 3 months ago. The accumulated exhaustion of 30 years of vigilance finally, gently, catching up to a heart that had held on, Valeria believed, specifically long enough to see both his daughters safe and both of them, in their own separate ways, happy. His final act as Don had been to formally recognize Bianca Ferro publicly before the assembled families as a full Contini daughter, deserving of the family's complete protection, regardless of the ordinary life she had chosen to keep living. A symbolic gesture that mattered enormously to a woman who had spent her whole childhood believing herself given away rather than stolen. Bianca had been at the funeral, standing beside Valeria at the graveside in matching black, the two of them holding hands, the way infants separated at birth are never given the chance to, weeping together for a man who had, in his final months, become something neither of them had expected. Not the cold architect of an empire built on violence, but simply a father, learning too late and too briefly what it might have meant to raise both his daughters together. He asked me at the end, Bianca had told her sister the night before the funeral, whether I could ever forgive him for what Nonna Assunta did. I told him there was nothing to forgive him for, specifically. He didn't make that choice. His mother did, in a hospital room, while my own mother was too unconscious to stop it. But I told him I was grateful, at least, that he spent his final months trying to undo whatever piece of it he actually could. What did he say? He cried, Bianca said, her own voice thick with the memory. I don't think I'd ever seen him cry before that moment. He held my hand, and he said he wished, more than anything else in a lifetime full of things men like him aren't supposed to regret, that he'd had 30 years to know both his daughters, instead of just one. Now, standing at the window with her hand against the swell of her pregnancy, Valeria thought about the curse her grandmother had believed in so completely that she had torn 2 infants apart to prevent it. The ancient Sicilian conviction that twin daughters shared a single soul, destined inevitably to destroy whatever family raised them both. She thought about how thoroughly that superstition had failed to predict what actually happened when the 2 halves of that supposedly dangerous whole finally found each other. Not destruction, but restoration. Not a curse fulfilled, but a wound 30 years old, finally permitted to heal. Marco found her at the window, as he often did in the quiet hours after their infant daughter, 6 months from being born, but already, in Valeria's private thoughts, entirely real, entirely loved, had settled into the rhythm of evening stillness that seemed to calm her whenever Valeria stood near this particular glass. Thinking about her again? Marco asked, coming to stand behind her, his arms circling her from behind, his hands resting alongside hers against the curve of their daughter. Always, Valeria said. I've decided something, Marco. If we have a daughter, when we have our daughter, I want to name her
Assunta. Marco went still behind her, surprised. After your grandmother? The woman who separated you from Bianca in the first place? After the woman who believed, with her whole broken heart, that she was protecting this family from a danger she genuinely feared, even though she was catastrophically wrong about what that danger actually was. Valeria turned in his arms to face him. I want our daughter to carry that name forward, but I want her to grow up understanding exactly what her namesake got wrong, so the mistake never gets the chance to repeat itself. I want her to know that twins aren't a curse to be feared and separated. I want her to know that love, once truly found, is stronger than 30 years of superstition and violence combined. Marco pressed his forehead to hers, the gesture that had, across 2 years, become their private language for the moments too large for ordinary words. Assunta Vitale Contini, he said softly, testing the name. She'll grow up surrounded by more love than either of us had, and more honesty than this family has managed in a century. That's the whole point, Valeria said. 200 miles south of them, in a small Chicago apartment that had once briefly held 2 sisters learning to become each other, Bianca Ferro sat at her own kitchen table, 7 months into her own pregnancy, David's hand resting warm over hers, a phone propped against a coffee mug so that her sister's face on video call could watch the ordinary evening unfold alongside her own. Tell Assunta her cousin says hello, Bianca said, laughing, watching Valeria's face on the small screen. Assuming yours arrives first. Mine's due in April. Yours is due in March. I think your daughter gets to claim the honor of arriving first, actually. Then tell her, Bianca said, that her aunt has been waiting her whole life to have a sister to share this exact kind of joy with, and now she gets to grow up with a cousin who never has to wait 30 years to know she exists. The 2 women, twins raised apart by a curse invented to keep them separate, reunited by an assassination attempt neither of them had chosen, bound now by a love that had cost each of them something and given each of them, in return, something they had not known they were missing, talked late into the evening, the ordinary rhythm of sisters catching up on ordinary days, while outside their separate windows, in Chicago and on Long Island both, the same dark autumn sky settled gently over 2 women who had finally, fully, stopped being halves of a divided whole and become, instead, exactly what they had always secretly been from the moment of their birth, complete and whole, and never again alone.